a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this amazing Congress. I think it's a great idea that you celebrate the diabetes educators, which we are very important for patients living with diabetes. Um, well, actually, I'm also working in the NHS as a pediatric diabetes dietitian. And I also live with type 1 diabetes myself since I was 4. So this presentation is going to be focused on research, it's going to be focused on experience and also on personal experience. And I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so I'm going to be telling you a little bit about why the post-meal spikes happen and how to prevent them whilst living with diabetes. It's going to be mostly focused on type 1, but a lot of the things also apply to type 2. Okay. Well, first of all, what are these postprandial or post-meal glucose spikes? They are usually happening because there's not like an agreement between the carbohydrates eating and the insulin action. So this is a very important thing to notice, that most of the people that are given insulin injections, they usually not waiting the amount of time that they need to wait to eat after giving the injection. So this kind of disagreement, what I like to say, between both of them working together is mostly what happens what causes these glucose spikes. Also incorrect insulin dosing or the meal composition. That was very interesting what you were talking before about it. And also we cannot ignore that people with diabetes have also alterations in digestive enzymes, which in comparison to a person that doesn't live with diabetes, they would absorb carbohydrates way much faster. Okay, so it could be that, for example, usually for a person without diabetes, they start eating, and 10 or 15 minutes after they start seeing a small spike. But maybe for other people with diabetes, with alteration in their enzymes, they can see as soon as they start eating a spike. Okay, so everything that I'm going to mention, as you already know, everyone with diabetes, they're so different. Okay, and why is it important to prevent it? So first of all, I would think about how people with diabetes feel when they have a post-meal glucose spike. So, well, personally, previously, if I was not preventing my glucose spikes, I was feeling really fatigued or lethargic. So people with diabetes might say, okay, every time I have my main meal, that could be lunch, I feel like I need a nap. I feel like I need to sleep. And most of them could be, I don't know, in school or working, and having this feeling is really bad. So first of all, how do you feel? And this is something that us as educators can ask them, like, how do you feel after you have a meal? Because some of them may not be able to recognize these spikes, but just about how they feel would help. Also, the most important one would be the HbA1c. So usually, depending on the practice, you may see 3 or 4 glucose readings or glucose levels. And so you are well controlled because you have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and before sleeping in range. But the HbA1c is not just those levels. The HbA1c is also what happens after you eat. And if you see in this image here, for example, this is giving the finger sticks tests. So the green dots, it's kind of a dot. The green dots are the times that the person is testing. Okay, so for example, you can test here and you notice you're high, but then there's a slight peak after that test, but you cannot notice if you're not using a CGM or something. And then you have a low, but you didn't notice it. Then you test and you were fine, you test and you were fine, another low, another high, and you were fine. So this happens a lot to people with diabetes, that they don't notice and they don't feel well during the day because of these highs and lows and these spikes. So it's also recommended for us to say to them, put attention also if it's a person that would like to go forward with the diabetes control also, because some of them might say, no, for me it's enough to test 4 times a day. I don't want to know what happens. But we should encourage them to also recognize what is happening afterwards. Okay, so how can we detect these glucose spikes? So there are different ways, but now that the previous doctor was talking about technology. Technology is a good way to join it with nutrition, for us to find out what happens with the meals. So first of all, a CGM. Well, I come from Costa Rica, and we don't have access to CGMs. We are just started having the freestyle liver, but now I moved to the UK, and here's just like, okay, you can have a CGM for free. So it's like, depending on the country where you live, is you have, of course, you will have a different access. But if you have access to a CGM, this is the best way to record what happens, how high you go afterwards, how's the peak going, and you can find the patterns. But something that I recommend a lot for the people that cannot have a CGM or a flash CGM is to record the levels in a food diary. So what I do, for example, if it's a young person, I put a lot of colors, and I put to them, okay, you need to test for at least 3 days, 1 hour after, and then 2 hours after to see. And you can make yourself a graph, and you can draw how are your levels during the day. So when they kind of join the dots, they can find out, okay, yes, after each breakfast, I'm going really high, and then I go down back to range. So when they found out that this is happening with their levels, they can put more attention to the nutrition side. So according to the ISPAD guidelines, the recommended levels after eating are between 5 and 10 millimoles. Okay, so if a level is going higher than that, is considered a spike. Okay, so higher than 10 or 180 milligrams per deciliter would be considered as a spike. So it is normal also, because people might sometimes feel like, okay, I started my glucose levels in 10 and they went up to 14. Why am so high? But it is normal for a person with diabetes, for the huge amount of things that are happening in the body, to go even 5 points above or 90 milligrams per deciliter above. Okay, so it's normal if the person starts in 10 to go up to 14. Okay, that's a normal spike, even though it's an undesired spike, because you're going from kind of 10, which is not the range, but you're going to a high. Okay, and even worse if the person is not controlled and you start 12, 13, and then you go up to 20s and stuff like that. So this is something that we can also highlight to the people living with diabetes. Like, don't get scared, this is normal, but how can we make it flatter? Okay, and this is an example of a person with type 2 diabetes, which usually the graphs look better than the ones of type 1. But we can notice with this person with type 2 diabetes, this is a freestyle liver, which is a flash glucose, continuous glucose monitor. How after breakfast, they have a spike. Okay, but you can see that after that spike, it comes back to range. But how would that HbA1c improve if we prevent that spike? Because if you see, the rest of the day is having like mini spikes, but not as high as this one in breakfast. So we can say, okay, now that we have recognized this, we know that it's happening always, it's a pattern. So what are we eating? At which time are you using the medication? So different considerations that I'm gonna mention during the talk. This is a CGM, a Dexcom. So this is a person with type 1. So you can see it's more like up and down. It's harder to see a flat line in a person with type 1 that is not in a honeymoon period or something like that. So if we see this one, it starts in range, but it goes way much higher than 4 or 5 points or 90 milligrams per deciliter. So you can see, okay, and it's sometimes even harder to take it down. I don't know if you have noticed it, but for example, when you're hypo, you just have a snack and it goes back to range. But when you're high, it takes more time to get down, and that's more frustrating for the person living with diabetes. So we can see here 3 spikes, 3 post-meal spikes. This one that was in breakfast, this is a real case. This one that was at lunch, and then this person ate quite late at that moment. So this one that was in dinner, and you see that all the time during the nights is sleeping high. Okay, it goes back to range, but it takes a lot of time to go down, and it requires a lot of insulin corrections. So this is a case that we can see, okay, if we don't have a CGM, if we kind of record it, having glucose tests, and we do have access to glucose testing strip, that's another thing, we can notice these graphs and we can say, okay, how we can work around this. And if we kind of prevent the spikes, we're going to see a better HbA1c at the end, or a better time in range. Okay, so how do we prevent these glucose spikes? First of all, low glycemic index foods, or as you have heard before, how to make high glycemic index foods to be able to digest better and not be so high, impacting the glucose. But usually what I like to say is also like to, you can choose, you can have everything, but how do you accompany that meal? Or what do you add to that meal? So there's some factors that affect that glycemic index. For example, if it's liquid or solid, a good example is the fruits. So a lot of people come and say, okay, I'm always having spikes at breakfast. I'm just having, I don't know, brown bread, toast, but I just get a high. And it's because they're having orange juice or apple juice instead of having an orange or an apple that contain more fiber. And that's another point, that is the fiber content. If the fiber content is higher, the glycemic index would be lower. So the glucose absorption would be slower and it would prevent a spike. Then also the fat content. If this is kind of a good bad one, because we can play also with healthy fats. To say, for example, you can add more nuts, you can add more nut butters or healthy fats to your meal so that it can slow the digestion and the absorption. Then the temperature also, if it's something hot or cold, if it's something hot, would be digested faster than something cold. And undercooked or underripe foods would be digested slower or absorbed slower than the ones that are overcooked, and processed and non-processed. So if you see, it's a lot of considerations to take on account, but we can find the best way of as the following. In the next image, you're going to see how we can do swipes and tell to the person, okay, if you're eating this, how you can make this to be absorbed slower. And we see some examples here in this image about the impact on the blood glucose level, and the one that is on the gray is what we would like to see in the people with diabetes that we work with, to have not so high spikes, but the other ones. Okay. And then there would be ways to prevent glucose, the glucose spikes with the insulin timing too. Okay, so for example, well, we know, I don't know, usually in India, what types of insulin you use mostly, but for type 1, you will find more ultra rapid insulin or insulin analogs, which might take 50 minutes to start acting. So if you think about it, if you're going to have a high glycemic in the foods, for example, just a lot of rice and some vegetables, a little amount of vegetables, and you inject after you eat, imagine the effect on the glucose level. Or you inject just before you eat. And if you inject 15 or 20 minutes before, there would be, you kind of would prevent the high spike. Okay. So also you can recommend to the person to decide the timing of the insulin according to how is the meal composition and also how's the glucose level. If you have a high glucose level and you're going to have a high glycemic index food, you might require to inject even 30 minutes before you eat, so that when you start eating, you're going to have active insulin in the body and you're going to prevent that spike. So this is a recommendation that works a lot, but also requires a lot of commitment from the person to be able to remind that 30 minutes. So it's like depending on the person. And also we need to consider if the person has diabetes complications such as gastroparesis, because of course this principle might not work with them. So with people with gastroparesis, as you may know, the digestion is much more slower. So in these cases, you might need to recommend to giving that insulin injection afterwards, after they eat, to prevent a hypo. So this would not work for them. And in type 2 diabetes, of course, if they're using sulfonylureas, it's good to also highlight the insulin timing, because it can also impact the post-glucose spikes, post-meal spikes. And also the accuracy in carb counting. So I know not all the people are carb counting, maybe carb counting, but if they learn how to carb count and they choose the right amount of carbohydrates for the insulin, or choose the right insulin with the amount of carbohydrates, they might see that the glucose spikes would be prevented, and they would be not so long, because if you don't count your carbs, most of all the people that may have some insulin resistance, the high glucose levels can last hours. And this is what afterwards affects the timing range and the HbA1c. So a book that I really love to use is the Cards and Cows book. They have also world foods version, which contains a lot of traditional foods from different countries. So there's also an app, and they're already working on the app for the world's foods. And something that I always tell to the people with diabetes is that practice a lot at home with the book, with the app, so that when you go out, you're able to just visually calculate more accurately the amount of carbs that you're eating. And also, I would recommend to the people to watch out snacks, because sometimes, mostly if they're children, they can be snacking during the whole day. So when they're gonna have a meal, they have like a spike from the snack, and then the next meal, another spike from the snack. So I would say, like, if you want to get a better time in range and a better HbA1c, I would prevent, or I would watch out the timing of the snacks. And this is me and my partner. So we're eating Indian food that is one of our favorite foods. And I must confess, well, he also lives with type 1 diabetes, and I must confess, sometimes it's hard to count the carbs. You should be more experts than me in that, because you're more used to have it. But in this case, for us, it's really important to be able to have an almost accurate, approximately amount of grams of carbs. And also, we kind of consider the amount of fat that may be present and the timing on the insulin. Okay, so that's what works for us. We have tried it ourselves. Then the food barriers. So what I was saying before, we can think, okay, you're having this meal, but what are you adding to this meal? You can have a high glycemic index foods. We are not going to tell to the people with diabetes to don't have this meal because it's bad. But we can say, okay, this meal, you can accompany it with food barriers, which are proteins, healthy fats, and fiber. Okay. So, for example, a lot of people might find that in the morning they have a higher glucose spike because of the hormones. So you can say, okay, in the morning, most of the people, mostly the children, we see here that they just have a cereal. Just cereal is like full, like is very simple carbohydrates. And then they have like skim milk that doesn't have fat at all. So something that we can consider, okay, is how we can give a twist to this breakfast so that you can prevent that spike. Okay, so another also good option is if you're going to have a meal that contains a lot of vegetables and salad, for example. If you're high, if better eat before the salad and the vegetables, so that the insulin can start acting when you're eating something that doesn't have carbohydrates. Okay, so it's a good option to also say, okay, with which part of the meal should I start to prevent that spike? And this is an example of something that we might recommend. So if you see these three options on the left, you can see just a pasta, just bread with a little bit of butter, and just cereal with milk. Okay, so these are three examples of something that you might say, okay, let's work around it to see how we can prevent that spike. So with the pasta, I would recommend to add more lean protein, for example, a low-fat mince meat or chicken or fish or tuna, okay? And we can add some vegetables. So we're adding there protein and fiber from the vegetables. Then if it's just toast, that I see it a lot here with my patients, for breakfast, I just have one toast. And it's just so simple. So it's not good nutritionally, and it would not be good for your glucose levels. So we can think about, okay, try brown bread instead of white bread. And if they don't like it, we can say, okay, try adding some cheese, try adding some butter, nut butter, try adding some eggs with it. Okay, so accompany the meal with other things that may not have carbohydrates that can help. And then also add healthy fats to, for example, the cereal. You can add some nuts like almonds or cashews, and low glycemic index fruits such as strawberries. Okay, and then at the end, just the last one is physical activity. So it's a good way, and I wouldn't say that it's just for the glucose levels, but like integrally, like how would they feel after they eat. And I think a walk about 10 minutes can make the difference in that spike. So we wouldn't recommend to do like a very strong exercise or anything, but just like a normal walk. It could be in the garden, it could be outside. That might improve insulin sensitivity and might help the digestion of the person. And another option with people that may not be able to just go for a walk, we can say, okay, can you schedule during the day the more active chores after the meal, such as if you go out shopping, if you need to go to buy from the supermarket the foods for the week, or housework, or walking the dog, instead of doing it in the early morning, you can do it after the meal that you might find that you have a higher spike. And that's everything. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to respond.